Hey guys, welcome back for another WSQ. Just wanted you to know that this is part of a two-part video. There's the first one, which we're going to talk about the Korean War and also the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then part two is the next video, and we're going to talk about the Vietnam War. So these are all considered Cold War hotspots, and that's going to be the focus of this video. Hotspots meaning that these were places of fighting where proxy wars were happening, which is essentially a war that happens between the Soviet Union and the United States indirectly. As you're watching the video, make sure that you answer the guided questions provided. It's okay if you have to pause the video or rewatch it in order to answer the guided questions. When the video ends, make sure that you're summarizing the main points of the video in paragraph form using the specific vocabulary given to you on your WSQ sheet. These are going to appear as bolded and underlined words during the video. And then finish by asking one question. This can be something you're still confused about, a general question, or a discussion question for the class. The essential questions that we're going to be covering during this video is how did post-war tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union lead to the Cold War, and then how did Cold War tensions affect American life? Spartan historians will analyze the way that the United States responded to the threat posed by the Soviet Union and evaluate the ways that the Soviet Union threat changed American life. So the Cold War is called the Cold War because there was no direct fighting between the United States and the Soviet Union. All the fighting occurred between proxy wars, or wars that are fought indirectly through other conflicts. So examples of these are the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and a couple other hotspots, mainly in the Middle East. And they're called hotspots because of the fighting that occurs due to the differences between the United States and the Soviet Union. But they're not fought between the United States and the Soviet Union, but they are fought between the United States and the Soviet Union, but they're not fought between the United States and the Soviet Union. We'll explain. So Korea before the war was a peninsula that's located between China and Japan. Once the Allies had defeated the Japanese in World War II, Korea was divided into North and South Korea because it had been owned by the Japanese before. The North would be controlled by the Soviet Union at the 38th parallel, and the South would be controlled by the United States. The presence of the Allies in Korea was supposed to be temporary. They were supposed to get North and South of Korea to agree to come alongside each other. But the Soviet Union installed a communist government in North Korea while a democratic government was established in South Korea by the Americans. They wanted to unite, but they couldn't agree on what kind of government they would have, whether it be communist or would it be democratic. In July of 1950, the North Korean troops crossed the border into South Korea, hoping to unify Korea under communist control. They drove Soviet tanks and they used Soviet guns. So if it looks like a Soviet, smells like a Soviet, might have been a Soviet. So the attack came as a surprise to the Americans, who had just finished withdrawing troops from Korea. The United States said that they would go to war in order to protect South Korea, especially their autonomy as a democratic nation, and it was seen as a place to take the first stand against communist aggression and, again, to contain the spread of communism in North Korea. They feared that if they didn't act, then it would send the message that the Soviet Union could just take over where they wanted to take over. And so they looked to the United Nations for support. And the United Nations said, yeah, sure, go ahead and use some force to stop the North Koreans. And it became clear, though, that the American troops were going to be necessary in addition to the UN peacekeeping forces. It's important to note here that the United States never declares war in the Korean War. It's all done through the UN. The North Korean forces pushed all the way to the southern tip of South Korea. The UN forces had landed in Incheon, which is about halfway up the Korean peninsula, in order to launch an attack behind the North Korean lines. They were able to regain territory pretty quickly and push back the North Korean forces. However, they're a little concerned that if they are able to push them back too far, that the Chinese would come to their aid and push the South Korean forces back. One of the major points of discussion during the peace talks that were happening at the same time that the Korean War was happening was, where is the border going to be? Is the border going to be at the 38th parallel? Is it going to be past the 38th parallel? Obviously, North Korea wants it to be at the 38th parallel, which would give them the most land. But the United Nations wanted it past the 38th parallel, making more land for the South Koreans. The negotiators couldn't come to an agreement, but the United States had also, during this time period, voted in Dwight D. Eisenhower, the World War II war general hero. Eisenhower had promised to end the Korean War as a part of his campaign. Once peace is established, Korea pretty much looks the same. Both sides suffered a lot of losses as a result, though. Following Roosevelt's 4 terms as president, Congress passes the 22nd Amendment because they didn't want a president to have to be able to serve more than 10 years. 10 was that sweet magic number because if you were a vice president and you became president through an assassination attempt or for whatever reason, then you could serve 2 other terms as well. Eisenhower ran on the Republican ticket. He was a really strong leader because he was a World War II hero, and he took a really strong stance against the Democrats for the way that they handled the Korean peace talks. Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, didn't want to just contain communism, but to be on the offensive and push it back to where it came from. He thought that the way to do this was a policy called brinkmanship, going to the brink of war without actually going to war. In order to do this, we would build more nuclear weapons, because nuclear warfare was the only thing that the Soviets were afraid of. He advocated for massive retaliation to respond with overwhelming force against anything that the Soviet Union did. He tried to scare the Soviets into surrender. Also under Eisenhower, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, was created to collect information and spy on foreign governments. The CIA is still around today. In 1953, the Soviet leader Stalin died and a new leader came in his place. Nikita Khrushchev emerged as the new leader of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had also started to create its own organization, kind of similar to NATO, called the Warsaw Pact, with the communist Eastern European countries that they had created along its border. The Soviet Union is in charge of this alliance, however, not similar to NATO. The Soviets would crush any opposition that would rise in Eastern Europe. Eisenhower also during this time period proposes an open skies policy in which that would give each of them the power to fly over the other one to check out for nuclear warheads. The Soviets rejected it, however, and when the Americans flew this over the Soviet Union anyway, the Soviets shot down the American pilot and held him captive until he was traded with a spy. An American movie called The Bridge of Spies movie is known for this conflict. In addition, there's also some conflicts in the Middle East. There are many tensions over it between the Jews and the Arabs after the creation of Israel in 1948. Egypt and other Arab nations are disappointed by the creation of Israel, and so they start to rebel and start to become allies with the Soviet Union. Egypt took over the British Suez Canal that had helped Britain and France to extract petroleum or oil from the Middle East. The Soviets had joined in on the sides of Egypt, allowing them to get access to the Suez Canal. Eisenhower didn't intervene in this conflict, and we allowed Egyptians to take over the Suez Canal. Eisenhower responded, however, with the Eisenhower Doctrine, saying that the U.S. has the right and will help any nation in the Middle East upon request if they are attempting to resist communist aggression. Eisenhower had also, before he left office, authorized the Central Intelligence Agency to train 1,500 Cuban exiles in Central America to invade Cuba, trying to overthrow the communist leader there, Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro had been very supportive of the Soviet Union and communism as a whole. When Kennedy becomes president under his reign, he authorizes the invasion. But the invasion was leaked to the Cubans ahead of time, so they knew that it was going to happen. It was a complete and utter failure because of that. The Bay of Pigs invasion really only sent Castro to be closer with the Soviet Union for protection. Kennedy didn't want to send backup in Cuba because he didn't want the Soviet Union to retaliate in Europe. He was worried that if they retaliate in Europe, that they would have some sort of problem and they would push against him in Berlin. Kennedy asked Khrushchev to meet with him in Vienna in an effort to ease tensions between the two countries. Khrushchev used the meeting as an opportunity to demand recognition of the communist Eastern European countries. Western Berlin was still controlled by the democratic nations, mainly the United States and Great Britain, while Eastern Berlin was controlled by the communist government, the Soviet Union. Kennedy worried that if he pushed against the Soviet Union, that they would use force to gain control of Western Berlin. Here's the look at what division in Berlin and also Germany was going on. The different zones of occupation are marked on the colored key. The United States in purple, the Great Britain in green, France in orange, and then obviously the Soviet Union in yellow. On August 13th, 1961, the communist forces closed the crossing points between Eastern and Western Berlin. They started to erect the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall had divided families, neighborhoods, streets, and even cemeteries. They eventually built a second wall parallel to the first one so that the Soviets could patrol the wall on one side. The policies during the Bay of Pigs and the Berlin crisis had pushed Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, to be a lot more aggressive. Khrushchev was really concerned about a second invasion of Cuba and also the American nuclear missiles in Turkey. These missiles were part of the intercontinental ballistic missile missions. The Soviets had responded by putting a lot more missiles near the southern border of the United States. The Americans overall criticized Kennedy, saying that he was too soft on communism as Khrushchev began pumping more aid and more missiles into Cuba. The Soviets claimed that the installation was defensive because the Americans had all sorts of missiles on their border. Kennedy reported that the Soviet activity to the United States, saying that if the claims are untrue, that the gravest of issues would arise. If they were going to be used for an offensive, then we would have some issues. Moscow said, well, the U.S. attack on Cuba would mean war. Kennedy started to assemble a group of advisors together that he called the ex-com to help him decide how to respond to the Soviets. And he decided to create a blockade of Cuba in an effort to force the Soviet Union to remove the missiles. He went on television telling the Americans that we're going to be on full alert about the Soviet Union threat. A Soviet ship was en route to Cuba as he was speaking with missile supplies on board. He was prepping the country for war if it was to happen. Khrushchev said that if you try to stop this ship, then we would go to war with them. The ships keep getting closer and closer in the United States, and they stopped right before they got to the blockade. 2 days later, Kennedy got a letter from Khrushchev saying that the Soviet Union would remove the missiles if the United States pledged never to invade Cuba again. Kennedy accepted the offer, and the Soviet Union removed their missiles. Make sure that as you watch the videos, you answer the guided questions provided. It's okay if you had to pause or rewatch the videos in order to answer the guided questions. When the video ends, summarize the main points of the video in paragraph form. You may want to wait to do this until after you watch part 2. Then you can finish by asking one question at this point. If you have a question about part 1, something you're still confused about, a general question, or a discussion question. We'll pick up part 2 in just a minute.